Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. I am so excited for the conversation that we're going to have today. This has been one that has been trying to put it together for a little bit here, and it's finally happening. And it's such an important conversation in the political sphere in the province of Alberta, tragically, for so many reasons. So, without further ado, our guest today is a professor at the University of Alberta. It's another one where it's like I could do half an hour of the show reading all his credentials and reading all of his awards. He's got the Order of Canada. He's written multiple books. He has a documentary out with CBC right now, which we're going to talk about. And he's got a new book coming out, which I'm super excited to talk about because I have this weakness for documentaries, and it'll all make sense in a minute. Very excited to welcome to the show, finally, Professor Timothy Caulfield. Mr. Caulfield, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you. I love the work that you do. It's so needed. And yeah, let's get into it.
Before we get into the lighter fare of conversation that we have lined up for today, he said, full of sarcasm. Um, I did sort of the brief introduction, but for our audience, and you can include, if you'd like, your involvement in, I believe, multiple punk rock bands. Who is Timothy Caulfield?
Oh my God, it's a great question. It's funny because my kids, who are all young adults now, they people ask them, "What does your dad do?" And they don't know what to respond. And I don't think they mean that in a nice way. It's like I don't know what he does. I think of myself really as a health and science policy researcher and an author. I love writing. I really do love writing. One of my books, I joked if an alien came down and said, you could only do one thing, it would be writing. I really enjoy the craft of writing, in addition to just, digging into the science and the research that's relevant to whatever topic I'm working on. So I think that's a fair description of what I do. And those two passions has led me to other great things like doing documentaries, and I love that process. And one of the reasons I love that process is you're working with a little team, especially on docs. The team is relatively small, usually 4 or 5 people, and you travel around together, and it feels a little bit like being in a band. which so maybe I'm the old guy in the band. To be fair, everyone on our doc team is way younger than I am, and they're also creative, and it is kind of like a band because you got the sound guy, right? That's the drummer, right? And then you got the director. I guess that's the lead guitar player. I don't know. and you have the fixer, and who's maybe the groupie, right? So it's not the groupie, I shouldn't say that. The roadie. And it is really a great creative experience, that work with these wonderful individuals who bring their own skill set. So, but that developed because of the other work that I do.
But I don't know. I feel like maybe the director would be more of like the manager.
Or the producer, the
Yeah.
guy who, I think that's probably, and Brent, he's really like, I think of him as Brent Hodge is the director. He's directed all the stuff that I've done. And I really think of him as first of all, a friend, but a collaborator, right? And they really, the goal is to try to bring out the best in both of us. And for me, he tries to tamp down the worst of me, I think. That's really his job. And he's just amazing. He keeps
Yeah.
it light too. A lot of the humor that you see in the work that I do is because of Brent. He really knows how to let a moment just be funny and not be patronizing and not speak down to people and just let the moment be fun. And I think that that's really important.
If he's not speaking down to people, then he's definitely not a lead guitarist. Uh,
Okay, good point. Good point.
um, there's a bunch of things that I want to talk about with you today. I mean, there's no question that you have done for anybody who's familiar with you, that you have done a significant amount of work on addressing the lies that we tell ourselves. I'll say the spheres of mis and disinformation. Um, but you also have done consistent advocacy work in trying to get people to uh, not fall prey to the mis and disinformation, particularly around health stuffs that's out there. So I'm curious to start with what got like that's a not easy thing to go like, oh, you know what I want to do? I want to tackle the deepest insecurities that people have that make them lie to themselves about health stuffs. That's what I want to spend my career doing. What got you initially interested in sort of that whole subject field?
Yeah, it's like, choosing to get hate mail every day and harassment and get people suing you and death threats. Um, I it really came from that. When I first started as an academic, I worked immediately on health and science policy, right? And so I'm not, sort of a traditional law professor. It's always been interdisciplinary research right out of the gate, right out of the gate. And that's because I had these amazing mentors like Bartha Maria Knoppers, who, she really was very much an interdisciplinary researcher. And that, I mean, like my first job, I was working with this amazing mentor. Mentor is so, so important in people's lives. And I became fascinated with the evidence and perspectives that are used to shape health and science policy. And it doesn't take long to realize that it's often not the best evidence, right? It's often not. Like there's a whole bunch of politics, um, pop culture, influencers, celebrities. All of these things shape not just public perception, but the actual sort of positions that we adopt, sometimes formally, but also kind of informally. So I became interested in that immediately, and so that's in like the late '90s, early aughts, and then we see the rise of a wellness culture. Gwyneth Paltrow et al. And Dr. Oz et al. And we start to see the degree to which blatant falsehoods are used to sell products, to exploit individuals, to shape health behaviors in bad ways. And I became very passionate about that. I mean, people can have different views on how they want to live their life. Of course, of course. And I'm actually a very strong advocate of freedom of expression. I actually think that's a punk ethos, right? Get your point of view out there. But with that comes this idea that we should be making sure that what is out there is truthful, right? And that people are making decisions based on the best evidence available. And that really became a passion of mine, and it's a passion that hasn't gone away. So I get very frustrated when people, especially politicians, say things that are just demonstrably false as if they're a truism. And we're seeing that happen more and more. We can disagree on everything from vaccines to climate change to GMOs to nuclear power, but let's do our best to make sure that those discussions are rooted in the facts, in evidence, in science. And if the science is uncertain and evolving, let's be honest about that. But let's not have those discussions based on lies. Really interesting research came out, no surprise, about the U.S. election, about the degree to which they were based on, the voting decisions were based on lies. And look, we have to be really careful. This is complex. This is correlation data, but lies about crime, immigration, the economy, and these are like demonstrably false things. Like this isn't like, oh, I disagree on the nature of the things that are just wrong. Crime's a good example, right? People that was high on people's reasons for voting. United States right now, crime at a 5-decade low. 5-decade. It's almost like you almost say like almost an all-time low, right? That's not the perception that people have, and that's not the belief that drove people's voting around that idea. So I could go on and on, right? Like we could disagree about crime, but at a minimum, let's try to root these conversations in facts.
And this is where I think that it's really difficult for the average person, and I use that carefully, and as the average is such a dumb word, but I think it's really difficult for the not hyper engaged person, let's say, that's probably a better turn of phrase, to navigate this stuff because there is no question that politicians writ large have figured out if I can make you afraid and if I can make you angry, then you'll give me money and also you'll probably give me votes and power. And historically, it seems like we went through a period where there was there were boundaries where you didn't lie. But this is one of the things. I mean, speaking about the U.S. election, and we're going to bring it back to Alberta politics in a bit here. But speaking about the U.S. election, one of the fascinating things that I've watched in the fallout of that election is Democrats have been running around going like, "Oh, but he lied about everything," and people believed it. And that to me is where I get really, really interested because it almost becomes about languages. Like Donald Trump is an incredibly effective communicator and he's able to tell people what they want to hear. And so they believe it. I'm probably oversimplifying by a lot. Democrats, in many ways, and US politics is complicated. So I'm oversimplifying for all the people who are thinking about sending me DMs right now. But Democrats had by contrast, the weight of facts largely on their side. And they weren't able to communicate those because I was listening to a podcast yesterday where there was a political commentator saying, but our economy is doing better than it has in years and years and years. And, Donald Trump's running around saying to everybody, the economy's in the toilet. And people wanted to believe that because their lives weren't where they said they were. So how do you combat the language that allows the proliferation of the lies that we want to believe with the truth?
And it is the lies that we want to believe, and I think that's really important. And again, I know this feels partisan when you talk about these things because we're picking on the right here. This happens across the ideological spectrum, and I think it's really important to hammer away at that. And look, I've been fighting wellness misinformation for a long time. For most of my career, the wellness nonsense came from the left, right? And so I got people from the left, hating me and saying that I was, ignoring cultural, different ways of knowing, and that I was, a scientist in the worst kind of way, scientism, that I was ignoring values, etc. This happens across the ideological spectrum, and you can pick topics like nuclear power and GMOs that still largely reside on the left. So I think it's really important to recognize that everything we're talking about applies across the ideological spectrum. But there's no doubt that study after study, we're talking a large body of well-done studies tell us that right now, it's this cultural moment largely happening on the right. And I'm going to give one more important caveat here. It wasn't always like that historically with respect to trust in science either. In the 1970s, research consistently shows that it was the Democrats in the United States that were the anti-science group, right? So think, Agent Orange, Vietnam War, Watergate, hippies. They were the anti-science, and the Republicans were strongly pro-science. It's totally flipped right now, right? So I think that's really important to recognize the complexity of the political angle when you're talking about misinformation. We just simply can't, rant and rage against the conservatives and the Republicans, which I tend to do. So, or at least people get the impression that I tend to do this. So that's number one. Number two, so much of this is about where people get their information, the echo chambers that we live in, and lots of fascinating research on this. Again, correlational data, so you have to be careful not to overinterpret that, right? Because often there's socioeconomics and education baked into that socioeconomic data, or that correlational data. But for example, if you're anti-vax, you get your information from very particular sources, and if you're pro-vax, the other way. There was a study that came out, I think, just last week that found that. Listen to this data. I think it's 35 and under. 35, either 30 or 35 and under, 40% of them get their news from influencers, right? Not journalists, not from influencers. So that's amazing. And 2/3 of those influencers are men who are conservative or lean right. So think your Joe Rogans of the world, right? That's that's the echo chamber, right? They're not fact checking on, they're getting their information from influencers. So these echo chambers are becoming more intense. So people may not even be aware of, that we were talking about the crime stats. They're not hearing that fact in their world. So the last point I want to make in response to your comments, which I think are really spot on, is this difference about the lies they want to believe, and I think this is really important. Um, in what direction is the misinformation causation arrow? So what do I mean by that? Do people say and think, I think crime is horrible because that validates a position they already hold? Something. So in other words, is there a belief or a behavior that they want to do that they're using misinformation to justify, or does the misinformation create the belief? And that's complex, right? That's complex. And I think the US election is a good example of that. Did people want to, believe, are they, do they lean towards believing these things because they want to vote for Trump and they're using these things to justify it, or that they have these conservative beliefs, or they have maybe even, I'm going to be careful about my language here, racist ideas about immigrants that they want to, they want to justify those beliefs, and they look for some way to do that. And there's interesting research about vaccines too, that people already, some evidence that people might just be skeptical, they don't want to get the vaccine, and they use misinformation to justify that perspectives. Stephen Lewandowski and his colleagues have done some really interesting research about the evolving difference between belief speaking and fact speaking. And they argue that the notion of truth is evolving. So fact speaking is kind of the old school notion of truth. It's rooted in science and evidence. Belief speaking is this idea that something feels true just because you believe the gist of it. You believe the gestalt that is being put forward. And there's some empirical evidence to back this up. So what do I mean by that? So if someone says something, Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson is so good at this. You say something emphatically enough, with enough conviction, and it speaks to your values, you believe it. It feels right to you. Even if you don't believe it's literally true, and there's an interesting study from a different group than Stephen Lewandowski's, even if you don't believe it's literally true, you believe the gist, and therefore it's true for you. And I think that's happening more and more, that maybe I don't literally believe these things, but I believe the overall sentiment that is being communicated in that passionate tone. And that's going to make it more difficult to fight misinformation, because fact checking the literal truth of it doesn't matter anymore. It's the gist, it's the vibe that matters more. And for sure that played a role in the election in the United States, and I think we're seeing it play a role more and more here. It sort of gives permission to people to be very elastic with the truth in how they see the world.
There's so much to unpack there. It is, I gotta say for the record, it is stunning to me when people say Tucker Carlson is such a good speaker, because I have watched that dude speak on more than a couple of occasions. I've never been to one of his events.
I've been doing this.
Wow, brave of you. And he just strikes me as so insincere. It's a performance, and it's fascinating to me that there is a segment of the population that looks at Tucker Carlson's absolute, like his laugh, the laugh that he does is so rehearsed. Like, I know that guy has spent hours in front of his bathroom mirror going like, I'm going to get this right. It's stunning to me, and I don't understand why people look at that and go, oh, that seems credible. I'd like to take even a portion of what he's saying. Why does that happen?
Well, I think first of all, I totally agree with you. And Tucker Carlson's a fascinating case study. I wrote a piece for the Walrus on his presentation here in Edmonton, and I totally agree with you. It just seems so insincere, so manufactured, like he's just playing to an audience. And in fact, why one of the reasons he's such an interesting case study is he, first of all, admitted that he lies. He knows he lies all the time. He used that as a defense to a defamation lawsuit, saying, and he won because his defense was no one could take me seriously because the things I say are so absurd. So this isn't defamation. And the judge agreed with him. The judge said, what you say is so clearly a lie. And this was Tucker's defense, by the way, that no one could take you seriously. We also know from the lawsuit, right, that they lost it cause Fox was at 800 million. I can't. It was a massive,
Yeah, the
massive
debate.
payout. Um, in there, there's an admission that he lies. So and he has actually said that on air that he lies, and he said, I don't know why I do it. On and on and on. Lying is his brand, and I think it really speaks to the power of this idea of belief speaking. All of that, right, can be out there, right? That this is clearly he's admitted he's lying, and we know we can use science and evidence to show that what he's saying isn't untrue. Despite that, he says it with such conviction and speaks to people's values and preconceived notions so much that people are still willing to believe it. I interviewed some of the audience at Tucker's event, which is really valuable because these are, you talk to them and they're wonderful, decent individuals, right? They were a real pleasure to chat with. And they say, "Oh, he doesn't really believe that. Oh, that he's just joking." And that goes to this idea. What matters to me is his overall sentiment. That's what matters to me, and that's what I believe. But holy cow, the damage that he does, right? Lifting up conspiracy theories and racist ideas and ideas about things like vaccines that are just demonstrably false. He does incredible harm.
Why do you think people like you were talking about the influencers piece, and that's a fascinating piece for me because I'll have conversations with people and say, "Oh, guess what I saw on TikTok? There's this thing," and my immediate reaction is, "Oh, I don't know about that," and I know a lot of people who have that immediate reaction of like, "Oh, I don't know about that," and they'll go and they'll do the Googling and the fact checking. Why do you think it is that there is less of that? Is it just people are so busy and they're so overwhelmed? Is it a confirmation bias? Like, what is it?
Yes, yes, yes. All the above. All the
Okay.
above. And again, research to back it up, right? So first of all, our information environment is just so frenetic and chaotic. It doesn't really invite reflection. Your phone doesn't really go, Tim, you should pause a little bit here and think about it. No, it's a chaos machine, right? And there was a study that came out again, I'm going to say last week, found that 75% of people share stuff without clicking through.
I
So
saw
in
your
other
post.
words, yeah, they see something and they pass it on. And a whole bunch of things are going on there, right? And because that same study found that when it's partisan content, and this is you're more likely to share it, right? Without clicking. Because, oh, this speaks to my values. I agree with this headline, passing it to my tribe. And again, the study found that we all do this across the ideological divide. But yes, in this cultural moment, big caveats here, conservatives do it far more, like far more. I can't remember, it was like 78 to 14%, something like crazy like that. A huge, huge difference but the researchers note this is largely because so much of the content is coming from the right. So that's an important caveat to why you get that number that conservatives are doing it more. But we all do it. So I think that's a big factor. The other thing you spoke to earlier is, if it plays to your fears, if it plays to your emotions, also more likely just to agree with it. Kate Starbird, she's a wonderful researcher at the University of Washington. We're really one of the leaders in misinformation research. I asked her for a project I was working on, what bit of advice would you give to people to avoid falling for and spreading misinformation? And I thought she said, oh, you fact check, do. No, she said her number one bit of advice is if it feels like your team just scored a touchdown, that should be a reason to pause, reflect, and double check. And I love that, right? Because I've done that. I've done it. I've fallen for stuff that played to my confirmation bias, my preconceived notions. So I think that's a wonderful bit of advice because increasingly, because of the algorithms, the content that we get, it does that, or it plays to our emotions. It's scary. It's right, fear mongering. It plays to grievances. So if it does any of those things, that should be reason to pause, right, and really, really reflect.
One of the ideas, and this is problematic in the province of Alberta right now, because historically, and maybe this is a lie that I'd like to believe, but historically, one of the things that we've seen from people in positions of leadership is they have sort of, to some degree, taken the forefront of saying, this isn't true. That is not true. That is not a reputable source. Um, and it seems like one of the major shifts that has happened in our information ecosphere is there's been an increasing abdication of that role. Almost this fear from especially elected leaders. I don't want to alienate people by saying, "Hey, the breakdown sucks." I don't want to piss off the three breakdown fans that are out there. So I don't want to say that the breakdown sucks. Instead, I'm going to say something. Oh yeah, no, I like podcasts, and there won't be that repudiation of demonstrable falsehoods. What do you think? Is that purely just craven politics? Am I remembering things with like? Am I looking through rose-colored glasses going like, I remember when people in positions of actual leadership used to lead? Is there any information that speaks to that?
I think you're right, and we are definitely seeing off the top. The whole topic of misinformation has become more about politics than any time in the past. And as someone who's politics was always there, it was always there, but now it's at the fore. The misinformation, conspiracy theories are so embedded into politics now that you can't disentangle them. And I'm come back to that. But I do think, I'm a huge fan of history, and I love listening to history podcasts and reading history books. And then you listen to these controversial lies of the past, Watergate, and they just seem like lightweight nothing compared to what it's the norm now. It's the norm. You think about even weapons of mass destruction, or you could go down the list of things that people thought were just horrible lies, and how could this happen? You should lose. Now it's just the norm, and what I find it incredibly depressing and distressing. Um, but I do think that what we're seeing is this idea that I cannot speak out against this misinformation because this misinformation has become an ideological flag for my community. So if you're a politician in Alberta, being anti-vax has become an ideological flag for the political right. It's almost a dose response, right? The further right you go, the more anti-vax. And again, evidence to back this up. There was research, for example, by Frank Graves. He's a well-known survey expert in Canada, and he did a study in Alberta where he found that. Listen to these numbers; they're astounding, and I want to make sure I get them. I'll be right. I believe it was if you were unvaccinated, you didn't get the COVID vaccine in Alberta. 93% of those individuals voted for the UCP, and somewhere between 3 and 5% voted for the NDP. That is unbelievable. Like, we do survey research ourselves. You rarely see that. That is incredible. So in other words, if you were unvaccinated, if you didn't get the COVID vaccine in Alberta, you voted UCP. You could almost say with some degree of certainty. That is absolutely incredible for something that should, it's science-based. Should be about public health. That is the degree that this has become about politics, and that incredibly heartbreaking, right? Because it will become more difficult to change people's minds because it is part of this. But if you're a politician, if you're Danielle Smith, it becomes much more difficult for you. So you get this cycle happening. It becomes much more difficult for you to say, look, this is not true. You've bought into conspiracy theories. I understand. You could do this empathetically still. I understand why you might have these concerns, but you don't want to say that, right? Because you don't want to lose your base. And then it becomes a stronger ideological flag. The cycle just keeps going on. And then, so therefore you have to lean into it. You got to lean into it. And so you've seen that happening in the United States, where you have jurisdictions, basically Florida being a really good example, becoming anti-vax, We have it starting to happen here, where it's almost like an official position of the government to be, and this just cuts against. It's hard to emphasize the degree to which this is scientific nonsense, right? That we can come back to what the data actually says about these things, but from a political perspective, we're seeing this happen with a bunch of topics. And one of my favorite examples, if I could take a moment to go
Yeah.
back to the idea of crime, I'm worried that whole host of topics are going to become like crime, where politicians can't speak about the truth. So what do I mean by that? Kamala Harris, an intelligent woman who has her finger on all the best data, she knows that in the United States, crime is at like a 5-decade low, especially violent crime, right? She knows that immigrants do not increase crime rates. She knows that, and she knows being tough on crime probably has marginal impact on crime rates. That's not what drives. She knows those things as fact. She cannot get in front of a microphone and go, I'm not going to be tough on crime because there's no evidence to back that up, that it makes a difference. And by the way, crime rates that are an all-time low. This should not be a priority issue. She can't say that, right? Because that would be political suicide. And I'm worried things like vaccines, alternative medicine, other climate change topics are going to become like crime is in the United States. And we're already seeing that happen with the sane washing that's happening in the United States around RFK Jr. and Dr. Oz. All of a sudden, RFK Jr. is no longer anti-vax. He's a vaccine skeptic. He has controversial ideas about vaccines. No, he's a hardcore anti-vaxxer that spreads incredibly harmful lies. Lies that he must know are lies that kill people. He's not a skeptic or have controversial positions. So we're already starting to see that evolution happen. And as that happens, it becomes more and more about politics and less about science and the facts.
There's a feedback loop that you're kind of describing there because you have, and I think we saw it in Alberta during the COVID pandemic. And I think Jason Kenney tried to, I am going to say moderately nice things about Jason Kenney now, and I'm sorry to everybody. It's the reality of things. I think he tried to sort of straddle that gap between the people who were spreading the misinformation and disinformation and the 5G and all of that stuff and trying because he knew that was a part of his base and still say, but everybody should get vaccinated. And I think that part of his downfall was that he did it very poorly. And this is where I'm curious for your thoughts because one of the questions has to be how do you de-escalate, deprogram? I'm not sure what the terminology should be. Somebody who has fallen down that rabbit hole because the on one hand, we've got the Tucker Carlsons of the world who are out there speaking emphatically, and laughing in frankly disturbing ways. And people buy into that energy. That's what you were talking about earlier. If you respond to them, how do you respond from like a no, Timmy, no, there won't be any microchips, or do you respond from a place of equal passion? What's proven to be most effective?
Well, you can hate my answer. It's it's complex. It's uncertain. Um, so my personal philosophy is if you're an RFK Jr. or you're a leading politician, or if you're making tens of millions of dollars off of lies, you can go all in and be pretty emphatic about how much this is a lie, and you can mock them and you can have fun with the cultural moment to try to cut through the noise because our information environment is incredibly noisy, and if you're just too quiet and carefully posting facts, no one's going to hear it, right? So I think there are strategies you can use, leverage pop culture moments. Maybe it's Aaron Rodgers saying something ridiculous about vaccines in order to try to get the truth. But if it's an individual that's trying to do what's the best for themselves and their family, I think you have to listen. You have to be empathetic. You have to get a sense of what their real concerns are. What are the grievances that led them to this place? And the other thing you have to recognize is they're part of the community. So so this is where the balance comes. It can become difficult. So I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, and I am in a way, but it is a balance. So when I get angry at RFK Jr. and make fun of him and say these are horrible lies, am I also insulting the individual that has the same concerns as RFK Jr. and creating more polarization and driving that individual more into an echo chamber? So that's a balance, right? Sometimes, I think science communicators like me get it right, and sometimes we get it wrong. But given how noisy the information environment is now, when you're talking about, the media writ large, we have to think of strategies that can elevate the truth, right? Elevate the truth and get it in, at a minimum, get it in front of people. Because there was this, a very recent study, I posted it today on social, about it's the echo chambers that are doing most of the harm here, right? It's not necessarily your political ideology. So that study found that if you get your information from multiple sources, from a diversity of political perspectives, you're less likely to believe misinformation. It really is the echo chamber that's doing harm. And again, this study found it's more likely to be conservatives that fall into these echo chambers. But again, this is a cultural moment phenomenon, and because so much of the misinformation is coming from that specter. So again, this speaks to this idea of trying to get people out of their echo chambers, trying to get people to engage with other content. There was a fascinating study that was done in the United States at Yale University where they actually paid Fox News individuals to watch CNN. Right, so they paid them an hourly wage to watch CNN, and it was a pretty big study. It was, I believe, it was over 600 participants, which is pretty big for a study of that nature, right? And I think they had to watch 8 hours of CNN a week or something like that. And I love this study because it's so cynical. Everyone involved knows what's going on, right? You're paying me to watch Anderson Cooper, and it's not going to work. It did work. It did work. So it is a good news study, right? Because it says, look, you get people out of their echo. And look, I'm not like a huge fan of, I'm not advocating for one of those cable news shows. The point is broader than that, right? If you get people out of their echo chambers and expose them to different perspectives, you can make a difference. Unfortunately, the echo chambers are just getting more and deeper. Like, people are leaving X for totally understandable reasons, but X is going to become this massive echo chamber for alt-right, sexist, racist commentary. I'm seeing it, believe me. And Blue Sky is going to become this academic haven where everyone agrees with it. That's not what we want. We want to have these tough conversations. I am a believer in the marketplace of ideas, despite what my haters say. And if I could, just one important caveat, I think it's important to highlight that most tools that are proposed to fight misinformation work within the marketplace of ideas, right? It's pre-bunking, it's debunking, it's critical thinking skills. It's not censorship and cancel culture, as those who are against fighting misinformation like to say. It really is about trying to get the good information in front of people.
Here's, I mean, the echo chamber piece is fascinating for me because there's no question that the social media companies have recognized that if I have this algorithm and it keeps you at a certain level of emotional, uh, that's the technical term, that you'll stay engaged, you'll continue to doom scroll. And to some degree, that's gross. I think that Maria Ressa has done some really, really important work in regards to highlighting how toxic that can potentially be. But I think she's also done a lot of important work highlighting how that can be weaponized. And one of the concerns and questions that I think that we have to start to grapple with is there are strong indicators, I'll say, that there are people in government who have clued into that. We've seen the communication strategy that's come out of the UCP government. They have their Your Province, Your Premier that they do the radio show with. They have the Alberta Update, which is an entirely internally produced biweekly program. But one of the other things that we've been exploring here on the show is they're also directing money towards these far right media organizations. I mean, we've got a fight back yesterday. We haven't released it publicly yet, so I'll do the Coles notes here and surprise everybody. Um, we did a FOIP trying to figure out how much money the government of Alberta was giving the counter signal, which is Angry Caillou's website that is historically demonstrably wrong. Like they get a lot of stories wrong. Um, the government of Alberta has given them over $100,000 in the last year. Uh, so there's there's pieces of this where again I want like how do you get the leadership, the people who control the public purse strings, the people who dominate the conversation by nature of their position, how do you get them to show some leadership in a not de-evolutionary way for the overall conversation?
And I think there's some interesting paradoxes here, if I could touch on
Yeah, yeah,
two
yeah.
real quickly, because one of the things that infuriates me, and this goes back to my comment about censorship and cancel culture and silencing, is this idea that we often hear from the right now. It's coming largely from the right that these narratives have been silenced, that there's this mainstream media that has this meta narrative that is, untrue and trying to manipulate you, and that these really important voices have been marginalized. It's a lie on so many levels. Number one, those perspectives, and we've studied this, are the dominant themes in pop culture, right? Uh, Joe Rogan, it's hilarious to hear people on Joe Rogan who say they've been marginal. You're on the most popular podcast on planet Earth. And some of these people who say they've been marginalized, they've talked to presidents and world leaders. They've been in the office one-on-one with these individuals talking. They Fox News is the number one cable news source. This is the dominant narrative, right? And for them to constantly say, and unfortunately, it's been a very effective strategy, right? To constantly say that they've been marginalized and we need to, the mainstream media is manipulating you is almost comical, but it can't be comical because it's doing so much harm. The other element here is this idea that, and I face this all the time, right? That I've been bought out by the Trudeau government. I'm a mouthpiece for big pharma, which is a lie. I get my grants from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and place other independent entities like that through peer review. I've never been paid to push any narrative ever in my life. But that doesn't matter, right? So they push that narrative and people believe it. Like of everyone, they think, oh, this is a meta narrative that's being paid by the government to. Meantime, the government is doing, the people who are accusing people are doing exactly that. And of course, you see this in the United States, real hugely with Elon Musk and Twitter, and you're complaining about censorship and cancel culture and manipulating the narrative. Are you kidding? And Trump has got Truth Social, and on and on. So again, it would be comical if it wasn't doing so much harm. I think one of the things we need to do is highlight this again and again and again and again, like you're doing. I know that sounds trite, and it may feel like it's not having an impact, but I think it does make a difference to highlight this again and again. That this is actually how it's playing out. And the other thing I think we need to do a good job of is explaining how the mainstream media actually works, right? How CBC, which is so maligned, people just hate the CBC. And yeah, I've worked with CBC, so I have to be, highlight my biases here, but I've also seen behind the scenes, right? I've worked with the National, I've worked with, CBC broadcasters. I have never once been told what to say. They have editorial independence. They have a board that keeps them, at arm's length from the government, et cetera, et cetera. You could argue more so than, private companies, but people just don't believe that. They think that it's a propaganda arm of the government. Meantime, people are listening to Joe Rogan, right? Who makes his money off of, creating an audience and creating grievance. Somehow that is more acceptable than this other, not perfect, makes mistakes like any. I'm not, here just say CBC hasn't made mistakes or something like that, or other mainstream media sources, But the portrayal that you often hear is just so inaccurate and unfair that it's maddening. But that messaging has worked. I mean, mainstream media now has become an insult, and people buy it. The word misinformation now has been twisted on and on and on. Alas, that messaging works because it plays to their preconceived notions and their desires.
Well, I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I wear this shirt today. Because if for anyone who's unfamiliar, the birds aren't real. I'm not going to explain the whole thing. You should go through the guy
I'd
who
be
did.
happy to.
It's such a genius experiment, I'll call it. Uh,
Performance art, in a
yeah,
way.
it really is, and it's fascinating because like I'll wear this shirt out in public, and the reactions are so diverse. I have gotten everybody who goes, "Oh, that's cool," because they know what it is. And then I've gotten people who say, "Oh my God, do you really believe that?" And no, birds are very much real. But I've also gotten people who are like, "Whoa, yeah, man." And they're sincere in the belief that they've swallowed up this piece of performance art, and they do believe the birds exist to spy on people. And that to me is so like I look at so many of the conspiracy theories, I look at so many of the misinformation and disinformation pieces that are out there. And there was a time not long ago where if you believed these sorts of things that were so detached from reality, there would be, and I don't mean to sound flippant when I say this, but there would be mental health resources that would be deployed to like, are you okay? And it has spread so exponentially that I'm curious, how do we put that, like, how do we get that genie back in the bottle? Can we get the tube, like the toothpaste back in the tube, or is it just we have a lot of people that we have to educate and bring up a whole new generation of people who can see through the bullshit?
Well, first of all, I love the birds aren't real. I use that oftentimes when I'm giving public lectures, and you can see the audience like, oh my God, how they react to it, and it's a brilliant. He got a little heat saying, people saying it was unethical. He didn't get ethics review to do this, but as you know, he lived this. Was it 2 years? He did it.
Yeah. Yeah, he did the tour, I think, for 2 years.
Yeah, too. He has a van. He's driving around. And one of the reasons I find it so fascinating is number one, it shows what you just highlighted that even completely absurd things like this, if framed as a conspiracy theory, there's people out there who want to believe it. And which I think he even that something this out there, right? Which I think was what his main point. But if you hear him talk about his experience, I think it makes another really important point. He talked about the wonderful community that felt like he was part of now, and he almost started to empathize with the people that believed the lie that he was spreading. And so I think that's a really important lesson there. But you're right. Let's just emphasize like things like chemtrails. The idea that chemtrails were a real thing, it's like a punchline. It's like flat Earth kind of conspiracy theory. And you have the premier of this province, and one of the leaders of another province. I think actually two other provinces, kind of leaning into it. Not. You can if you I'm sure you've seen the actually I got the clip from you but you can see our premier kind of doing a dance when you get her body language and everything, right, where she's I don't want to say this is completely false, but I've got to somehow legitimize it and give the impression that I hear you, I hear your concern. That incredible, right? The kinds of vaccine look the kinds of vaccine misinformation that people believe, it's hardcore. It's not I'm worried about adverse effects. I think 1 in 200,000 is too much for me. It's I think the COVID vaccines are killing people. I think the COVID vaccines changed my DNA. I think that I think the COVID vaccines killed more people than they helped. It's hardcore lies they believe, and the government. You see the government kind of hesitating to push back against it. The homeopathy thing is another good example of it. I love the topic of homeopathy because you don't have to pull the punches at all, right? It's not some strange culture or a different way of knowing. It's just straight up pseudoscience. It's a punchline in my world, right? And you see the premier when she was asked, is the government gonna fund homeopathy?" Not saying there's no evidence to support this at all. You know, they've done lots of studies on this. It's scientifically absurd. It's no. She goes. I think that she went, absolutely. I love what you're saying. Does she really believe that? I don't know, but she has to kind of validate it because conspiracy theories have become politics. That's where we are now. And unfortunately, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse given what's happening in the United States.
I'm curious, because when she gave the chemtrails answer, there were a lot of people that seemed to be very, very enthusiastic to try to carry water for her attempted answer. Now, I come from a performance background. I've played in bands for years and years and years before I got into this, and I would argue that this is still to some degree performance. You've played in punk bands. Um, what would have been the answer that you would have liked her to give, not only from a leadership standpoint, but from like a de-escalating maybe some of these myths? Because it seems there's a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, she was trying to give them an answer that was like, no, no, it's not true. But then she could tell she was losing the room. And so she had to not lose the room. And like as soon as people say she had to not lose the room, I'm like, no, no, no. She absolutely should have lost the room. Because back when I played in a band, if I had a Nazi walk into my show, I said to everybody in the room, get the fucking Nazi out of here. Um, that's me. I'm not the premier of Alberta, probably for the best. But what would have been the answer that you would have liked to see Danielle Smith give in that moment? And if you were going to coach her going forward, let's say, as a hypothetical for fun, Daniel Smith comes to Timothy Caulfield and he says, "Oh, that was a tough moment there. What should I have said? What would your
I
answer
think
be?"
the chemtrail clip is fascinating because I think you described it exactly, right? Um, she said, you know, as far as I know, I want to make sure I'm just paraphrasing here.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no evidence that that's happening. And whoa, I think there were actually people moaning in the audience to that response. And then she said, but if it is happening, it's the Department of Defense, and that's outside my jurisdiction, right? So basically, that is complete validation of the conspiracy theory by saying that. That's like, and I don't think we should, soft walk that, what do we call it?
No.
That was complete valid. They tried to say that, later that she wasn't saying it. That is complete validation of a theme in the chemtrail conspiracy theory. I think you can be empathetic. So I would say, and I actually said this, I've said this on social media, you can still be empathetic. You can say, listen, I really understand your concern here. And I know that you're hearing this conspiracy theory a lot, and it does sound concerning, but the evidence does not support it. It's never supported. There's never been any evidence to support this. And I think we need to do our best to get a sense of why we're worried about it, or what's the concern that's really driving your embrace of this idea. Um, I think she can still be empathetic, and I think she can still talk about what the evidence actually says without validating the conspiracy theory. And she did that with very similar with homeopathy. I think it was worse with homeopathy because she basically made it sound like they were really considering funding homeopathy, and then later on the minister of health said that they were having conversations about funding homeopathy. um, that's all to keep the base, to maintain this. I can't believe that they actually think that homeopathy works. It's really about managing the audience, which is ironically patronizing of them, right? It's insulting to her voters that she thinks that her voters can't handle the evidence, that she has to treat them like they're kindergarten students asking about the tooth fairy, right? When she should really be treating them like adults and telling them what the evidence actually says. And if she loses votes because of that, and she's not going to, she's not going to, I think, who are those people going to vote for? Um, then so be it, right? As you said, stand up. Principles have to play a role in politics. They have to, don't they? Don't they?
I would like them to.
The other thing I think is really important to highlight to our conversation is this idea about changing your mind on something, right? And in politics, it's called flip-flopping, and it's like one of the worst things you can do. It's like you're supposed to get this idea, and then it becomes ossified in your brain, and you can never change your mind. Look, I think it should be a badge of honor to change your mind if the evidence changes or if your new evidence is introduced to you. But increasingly, politicians can't do that. They can't change their mind, right? And I'm worried because of that. No matter how much evidence is put in front of Danielle Smith, she's not going to change her mind on all of these topics because it's become all these topics have become ideological flags, and then it becomes very difficult to pivot.
Is there a way to deprogram a premier? I think that's the question that I really want to ask because, again, it's so frustrating and quite honestly heartbreaking to see her willingness to accept some of these ideas that are demonstrably causing harm. Her position on ivermectin. I mean, the chemtrails thing, whatever. That's like, go watch X-Files. But when we're talking about some of the health policies, like the the questions around the vaccines being distributed to physicians across the province. It appears that that was a very deliberate choice. That's a problem. People will suffer and die because of that. When we talk about her propensity for advancing alternative treatments, the ivermectin, the famous ivermectin video box, that causes demonstrable harm. And these are positions that she hasn't disavowed. And certainly, I would make the argument that a lot of her social policies that she put forward and ahead of her AGM, the sex ed stuff, we're going to see nightmarish stuff come out of that, but also the anti-trans policies that she's put forward that there's just no evidence for. How do we deprogram a premier, please?
The interesting thing is, do we need to deprogram her, or or is this all political posturing? And I don't know what's worse. Nate. Like, what's worse? Does she really believe this? In which case, that's scary because that means she's completely out of touch with science and evidence. Or does she know it's false and she's just cynically adopting these positions because it's advantageous from a political perspective? Which one's worse? Which one's worse? To have a premier that needs to be deprogrammed, or a premier that is so cynical about facts that she'll say anything for votes? I don't know what's scarier. And the chemtrail thing, and I make an argument about this in a forthcoming article. The homeopathy and the chemtrail thing. We can laugh about it, but I think it is harmful because it normalizes and legitimizes the embrace of pseudoscience. Right? It is. I think it is harmful. I think we can't give up, and I'm worried that there's just so much noise and bunk happening. Thinking I couldn't keep up to what was happening in the United States. I just couldn't. I couldn't keep up, and it's almost like, okay, I'm tapping out. It's like the insanity, the not the health misinformation that was just every day. It was like every hour there was something new. We can't give up. We can't be exhausted. We have to forge ahead. We have to, at a minimum, let's keep the record straight. Have the truth out there available for people. Because if we give up, they're just gonna win. And we're like, this is gonna sound like hyperbole, like I'm being overly dramatic, but it's almost like you can feel us slipping into a dark age, like where we're losing. The candle is going out, to reference Carl Sagan. We can't let that happen, right? We can't. So you know what we have to do? Have to just keep fighting. And the other thing I find, and I'm going to be a hypocrite because I've said some nasty things on this podcast, but I also think we have to try to be a little bit more. We do need to be positive, because the other thing is they're so nasty, they're so aggressive, they're so rage filled. Let's try to get some light out there too, right? Let's get some positivity out there. Yes, rage and hate and negativity wins, but I think if we are just positive enough, long enough, we can make a difference.
Yeah, I always like to say, like, what you were talking about, the admitting mistakes and learning from your wrong. I know that one of the things that a lot of people find infuriating about me is if I get something wrong, I'll go, oh, okay. And that's it, because I don't view learning a learning opportunity as something that diminishes me. And I think that that's to your point of what you were saying there. I think that if we can let people know, if you want, if you're at a place where you're able to entertain the possibility that you might be wrong about chemtrails, that doesn't diminish you. That elevates you. If you're willing to reassess a notion that you hold, that doesn't make you a weaker person or a lesser person. That makes you better, faster, stronger. I didn't. What?
It, I do think this is a really important point, and maybe you didn't want to land on this, but this idea of scientific humility, right,
Yeah.
is incredibly important. And again, there's research to back this up. If you have a degree of scientific humility, less likely to believe misinformation, less likely to share it. I think it's a really important concept. In my forthcoming book, I say that we should have a list of things that we've changed our mind on, that we have, or even just modified our belief on, based on evidence. And I have a list, and I have it in the book. And also when you've fallen for misinformation and you've changed your mind, we found out. And if you don't have that list, if you can't put anything on that list, something's wrong. Something's wrong. You need to recognize that you can change your mind. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. So, science is hard. It is hard, and it's constantly evolving, and we have to be open to that reality.
You've got the new doc out on CBC Gem, Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger. That's the bit I was trying to get to there.
Nice
Um,
segue.
you've got the new book coming out. I want to make sure I get the title right. The Certainty Illusion: What You Don't Know and Why It Matters. Here's what's I got to share this little anecdote, and then I know that I've pushed you way past the time that you said you do, but I do that. Here's what's wild to me about that, because that to me harkens to a uncomfortable realization that I came to a while ago. There's a movie, I always get the name wrong. I think it's called The Unknown Known. It's a documentary on Donald Rumsfeld, of all
Yeah.
people. And the end of that documentary, how it works around the idea of you have to be aware that there are things that you don't know that you don't know. Um, and the title of that book kind of that's where it took me. Um, when does the book come out? What can people look forward to from it? Where do they get it? And then I'll let you go.
It is called The Certainty Illusion, and it's going to be out January 7th. And in the book, I talk about how we are in the midst of a knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination crisis. And I do try to have fun. It sounds like a dark topic, but I do try to have fun in the book. And I try to use fun examples in order to highlight this happens to all of us. For example, I talk about how I have a little UFO tattoo there. How there was a moment I was all in on on UFOs, right? On the UFO conspiracy theories. I loved it. So I think we have to recognize that can happen. And in the book, I sort of talk about a number of those journeys and how this idea of certainty is used in an exploitive way, in a way to manipulate us, and in a way that does a disservice to what the science actually says. And of course, I try to give recommendations both on a macro level, for institutions like universities and governments, but also for individuals about how we can chart, a path forward that is enlightening.
Perfect. I don't want to wait that long. You missed the Christmas season there. How did you not have? Why wouldn't that come out before the Christmas?
Talk to my publisher. It's beyond my control, right?
You're going for that
I'm a
gift
mere
card market.
puppet, right?
You got to get that post-Christmas gift card market, I guess. Timothy Caulfield, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I'm so glad that we were finally able to make this happen. I am so glad that you showed up in a Clash t-shirt, because it matches the sticker. Anything else you want to say? Anything else you want people to hear before I let you go?
I will just say thanks for all the work that you do. I know it's a dark information environment out there, and it's nice to see a few candles like your show.
That's very kind. Thank you, sir.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdowns audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.